Nintendo predates video games by a good 100 years, having started learning about game design as a humble card company in 1889. But even when the fledging company was learning about game design in the playing card business, it would be some time before the company settled on video games as its main source of profit. So, what was the journey from Hanafuda cards to Pokémon cards? How did they grow the video game company off the backs of a taxi firm, and when did Mario change the game forever? Well, it's time to learn how history works as we walk through the history of Nintendo from a playing card company to the biggest media company in the world. And before we start with the company, we need to start with the man, Fusahiro Yamauchi. Fusahiro Yamauchi founded the company under the name Nintendo Koppai on September 23, 1889, focusing on hand-painted Hanafuda cards, a traditional Japanese game with images of flowers on their faces instead of numbers. It was a response to the Japanese government lifting a ban on Hanafuda. Other card makers knew the unpopular game would disappear as quickly as it arrived, but the eagle-eyed businessmen knew that its hand-painted work would be enough of a gimmick to make an impact on the market. From here, the company started to slowly grow into Japan's largest card-selling business, but the plucky entrepreneur at the helm was keen to experiment with other markets. After all, by 1902, the first Western-style playing card was being prepared for export, so clearly, the company had room to grow. Perhaps Nintendo was going to be cross-purpose in the same way that Sony now does with electronics and movies? For now, the company focuses on what was in front of it, but this instinct to try new things would become an underlying philosophy for the company, both in game design and in which market to enter. Then a few decades later, there was change. Founder Fusahiro Yamauchi had been running the company from inception right up until 1929, when he anointed his son-in-law, Sekihiro Yamauchi, the successor. Unfortunately, a stroke forced Sekihiro's early retirement in the 1940s, which meant that the company needed a third president fast. So who did Sekihiro select to take over? Was it his loyal managers who he had brought up as they built the company together? Or was it his 22-year-old grandson with the same name as him? No high score for guessing which way he went. Hiroshi Yamauchi was still in college when he was confronted with this choice. He would later say of this historic moment in the 2010 book A History of Nintendo, "It would be a lie if I said I was enthusiastic about taking over Nintendo. I was young, I had mixed feelings, but in front of me, I had a family business with no head and all of its employees waiting to know what was going to happen to them." Part of the young Yamauchi's stipulation for leaving school to work for the family firm was that there was no family. Yamauchi wanted to be the only Yamauchi, to which his grandfather Yamauchi, not to be confused with the Nintendo founder, great-grandfather Yamauchi, agreed. As one might imagine, longtime employees weren't too keen on this inexperienced college dropout calling the shots. They didn't take him seriously and resented him. But Yamauchi offered them a peace deal by firing anyone who questioned him. The first on the chopping block were the longtime managers from his great-grandfather's reign, but aside from internal changes, there were going to be external changes. The company was renamed to Nintendo Karuta, and the new HQ was set up to be in Kyoto in 1952. Clearly, he had ambitions, which are probably what helped them become the first to successfully mass-produce plastic playing cards in Japan in 1953. Then, 6 years later, Nintendo struck a deal with Disney to plant their characters' faces on their cards. That helped them sell an unprecedented 600,000 units in 1 year. Based on this success, the company changed its name once again, this time to Nintendo Co. Soon, the company went public with Yamauchi as chairman. It was time to level up, but a change was yet again on the horizon. Yamauchi took a visit to the United States Playing Card Company, the world's biggest manufacturer of playing cards, and what he saw shocked him. A tiny office, a tiny factory. This was the biggest card company in the world, and had the bank balance to prove it, but it didn't seem big. He saw now the limit to growth. Upon returning to Japan, Yamauchi decided to diversify the company. This was the swinging 60s, for goodness sake. The whole world was changing, so it was time to experiment. New ventures included a taxi company, which he dropped when unions got involved, a love hotel, which he apparently frequented, and individually portioned instant rice. If you've never heard of them, it's because they all failed. Nintendo was now on the brink of bankruptcy. It was almost game over. So whatever he was going to gamble on next was going to be the last gamble he could afford. Then one day, Yamauchi spotted a factory engineer, Gunpei Okoi, playing with a simple homemade extendable claw to entertain himself on break. Yamauchi demanded that this claw enter production, and then the Ultra Hand was born in 1966. It sold 1.2 million copies in Japan alone, but it was the worldwide success that convinced Yamauchi that toys were the way forward. He set up a new research and development studio with Yokoi promoted to head it, and by head, he was the only one. Actually, that's not true. Another employee tagged along to do the finances. It's the 70s now, and Nintendo is starting to take note of these new things called video games. In 1977, they would release their first ever console, the Color TV Game 6, a knockoff version of the arcade hit Pong. It sold 1 million copies, which justified greenlighting the Color TV Game 15. Interestingly, each unit sold actually lost Nintendo money. Yamauchi correctly identified the steep pricing as to why home consoles hadn't taken root, while arcade machines were raking in quarters from one machine. Nintendo got around this by shaving development costs and pushing the sale of their slicker, bolder CTV G15, which had double the amount of games. Yet their successes were not being replicated over in America, where they had newly set up Nintendo of America in 1979. After Radar Scope, an ambitious arcade cabinet had failed to capture attention overseas, it seemed once again that the company had reached the limit of its success, first in playing cards and now with this trendy new toy of video games. But change was once again making an appearance, this time by changing thousands of unused Radar Scope cabinets into a game about a monkey throwing barrels. Shigeru Miyamoto is probably the most famous man at Nintendo other than Mario. Upon graduating from Kanazawa Municipal College of Industrial Art and Design with a bachelor's degree in Industrial Art and Design, the gifted young artist and banjo player would be given a proposal to work at Nintendo. It just goes to show how far talent and grit can get you, but it also shows what can happen if your father is a personal friend of Hiroshi Yamauchi. Shigeru showed his portfolio of toy ideas like animal-shaped clothes hangers for children and was hired as a concept artist to plan new products. He tinkered and improved many projects at Nintendo, even with their Space Invaders knockoff, Space Fever. But cut back to the Radar Scope fiasco, and Nintendo of America is on the ropes. Radar Scope was delayed by 3 months, which meant when they arrived, they were already old news, outdated, obsolete. If Nintendo was going to stay afloat, they needed a new game now. Yamauchi was reluctant to pull employees away from the company's bigger project, so instead gave a chance to Miyamoto to see if the inexperienced game designer could actually make something. And by chance, I mean see if the young employee out of his depth could save Nintendo of America in one try. Miyamoto shadowed Gunpei Yokoi, the maker of the Ultra Hand, and had a crash course in game design like you wouldn't believe. After all, Yokoi was leading R&D 1, the first of 3 teams all competing internally, and was putting the finishing touches on the Game & Watch, the world's first handheld video game console. So that'd be like shadowing Steve Jobs when he was putting the finishing touches on the first iPhone. Add that to Miyamoto's own ambition to rival Pac-Man, and you have a kid primed for success. For his own game, the Mario Maker threw in a story, a monkey steals your girlfriend, and after failing to acquire a Popeye license, he threw in his own character, a red mustachioed man named Jumpman. This was still some years before he would be named after Nintendo of America's landlord, Mario Segali. It was a smash hit and a cultural phenomenon. Plus, the Game & Watch was turning LCD screens into dollar signs worldwide. Now, it was clear for Nintendo that in the same way they had to move on from cards, it was time to grow up from toys. Video games were their future. No, video games were their destiny. But as the company entered the 80s, Yamauchi knew that arcades wouldn't be around forever. Even though manufacturers had avoided home consoles since the home system crash of the 70s, where oversaturation and low quality killed the Atari, and where thousands of copies of E.T. were buried somewhere in the Nevada desert, Yamauchi knew that if he could make Hanafuda cards popular again, that he could make the home consoles a viable market once more. Work began on the family computer, aka the Famicom, or NES as it was known outside of Japan, with Yamauchi so confident in Nintendo's new console that he promised an electronics company 1 million unit orders within 2 years. That goal was achieved quickly when the console launched in 1985. Now, Yamauchi had realized the importance of software and made the system easy to program. He also favored artists designing games instead of technicians, no doubt influenced by his bet on Miyamoto paying off. What ensued was a voting system where Yamauchi assumed the role of Caesar at a gladiator stadium. He, and he alone, was the only person who could decide whether a video game would be allowed on their home system. 3 years after the NES changed the company and the world, Yokoi unveiled what would be his magnum opus, the Game Boy. Alas, Yokoi would die in a car crash 1 year later, and never saw how his handheld creation inspired the likes of the DS and even the Switch. And he wouldn't even live to see how his own video game series Metroid would receive fewer updates than Microsoft Paint. But he had seen how his apprentice's stellar Super Mario Bros. Had already become a video game icon when it debuted alongside the home console's launch. Now, it's 1989, 100 years after Nintendo was created, and the company is a household name globally. Playing cards and toys are no longer a large part of the company's revenue streams, but they would eventually return over the coming decades to service the franchise and characters of their popular video games. Time will tell if Nintendo will return to taxis or love hotels with Mario and Pikachu's faces on them. But seeing as the company is veering into its own film studio, Nintendo Pictures, it's fair to say that Nintendo has bigger ambitions, just like it always has. Looking back on Nintendo today, there's a lot of good things to say about them. But how will historians think about them in 100 years from now? Or what the hell will they think about us? Go and watch our video on what historians will hate about us in 100 years. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.